Taking a look at the fantasy values of this year's Buccaneers, that and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this Wednesday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media, covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message, no ads or hashtags or anything like that. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. The sport stops sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Fantasy football drafts are now ramping up. So since there was no practice for the Bucs on Tuesday, I thought this would be the perfect time to go through some of the top Buccaneers fantasy options compared to other players within the NFC South. We're going to talk about running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends all coming up in a little bit. But let's start with the quarterback position and Baker Mayfield. Now, Mayfield isn't generally a popular fantasy quarterback, and some of that has to do with the inconsistent history over his career, and some of it has to do with the limited ceiling that he has. Most people, when they draft for fantasy football, they want the upside of a rushing quarterback. That's why players like Justin Fields and Kyler Murray, while they aren't great NFL quarterbacks, they're popular because they have built-in run production in fantasy. It's the same reason that a lot of people are taking rookie quarterback Jayden Daniels from the Washington Commanders, and it's because he's going to run the ball. He has that built-in floor of a rushing quarterback. Baker runs when he needs to, but it isn't a big part of his game, so you can't really rely on that in fantasy. You take it back to last year for the 2023 season, he finished as the quarterback 10, which, given that he went largely undrafted, that was a huge value for those that were able to pick him up and play him off the waiver wire. However, that's coming off of a career year in touchdowns and yards. So you're asking for him to replicate that level of production in order to help you win week to week. While his overall finish was solid, it was on the back of a few huge weeks, but he was largely inconsistent. Just under half of his games resulted in a top 12 finish. So basically, it's a weekly coin flip as to whether or not you could have started him or started a different quarterback off the waiver wire that would have given you a better fantasy result that week. Quarterbacks like Jake Browning, Sam Howell, Nick Mullins, and even Deshaun Watson had a better rate of top 12 finishes than Baker Mayfield did, and all of them, except for Howell, played significantly fewer games. Baker has actually only finished in the top 12 for an entire season once in his career, and it was last year. So the risk involved in drafting him is pretty high. Now, of course, there's the belief that he can perform even better than he did last year, which is great for the Buccaneers and real actual football. But in the landscape of fantasy, it's not going to provide a massive boost, at least not big enough that it makes him a guy that you're going to have confidence in starting each and every week, especially not with the Buccaneers schedule. If you're the type of person that picks up and drops quarterbacks in order to play the matchup because you focus more on receivers and running backs at the top of the draft and in those early to mid rounds, then Baker is a guy that you could use a late round pick on to start for the first couple of weeks. To open the season, they get Washington, who was the best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks last season, followed by Detroit, Denver, Philadelphia, and Atlanta. All of those games, except for Denver, were top 10 matchups for fantasy quarterbacks in 2023. After that, though, it gets pretty dicey. The Saints and Ravens are both terrible fantasy quarterback matchups. And then when you get to the fantasy playoffs, which are generally weeks 15 through 17, Baker has two of the worst fantasy quarterback matchups in Dallas and Carolina. It's a bad matchup against Dallas because they have a very stout defense, especially a really good pass defense. In terms of facing Carolina, Carolina was actually one of the worst fantasy quarterback matchups in 2023. And a lot of that was because they got down so early and so big that teams stopped passing the football. So although your actual team might have beaten the Carolina Panthers by 15 or 20 points, your fantasy quarterback was probably under 200 yards and maybe had a touchdown because your team was running the ball so much. Baker is at best, to me, a pick up and start off the waiver wire kind of quarterback based on his matchups. He's not a guy that you can plug and play and start all season long. And if you have a deep bench and you carry two quarterbacks, he's the one that you could stash and start when you need him. We're talking 15th round or later type of pick because he's still going to be sitting there at the end of drafts. He is on average the 23rd quarterback taken off the board. As far as the divisional comparison is concerned, he's one of two quarterbacks that you could start with confidence more often than not. Kirk Cousins obviously is the other one, and he's still a guy that's going in the 14th round. So they're right along the same level. There's not a huge gap between the two. I would not draft Derek Carr, and I would not draft Bryce Young, given the state of both teams. The Saints do not have a ton of offensive weapons, and Young was a complete disaster last season and is now in a completely new offense under Dave Canales that is going to revolve around Jonathan Brooks once he returns from injury. And again, I'm going to remind you that this is fantasy football, and it's exactly that. It's fantasy. This is not me saying that Kirk Cousins is going to have a better year than Baker Mayfield or that Baker is going to have a bad year. But even if he replicates his stats from last season, he may finish outside the top 12. Baker could be fantastic in a game with an 80% completion rate and 300 yards with one touchdown. And, it's because the Bucs run in one or two more touchdowns. And I'll come on the show and I'll talk about what a great job Baker Mayfield did in the game. But then you're going to look at your fantasy matchup and see that he only got 16 points and finished outside the top 12 for the week. That is not going to help you win your fantasy matchups. It's not going to help you win your fantasy championship. So you love to see that Baker completed over 50% of his passes in the red zone. You love to see that 50% of his touchdown passes came in the red zone. But is that a sustainable amount given the additions to this Buccaneers roster that were made to help the run game? I'm talking about Bucky Irving. I'm talking about Ben Bredeson. I'm talking about Graham Barton. And while Bredeson and Barton are there to protect Baker Mayfield, is he going to have a big enough jump to keep a quarterback one finish? And by quarterback one, I'm referring to a top 12 finish on the season, meaning he was one of the, top starting quarterbacks of the year. I'm just not confident enough in him to be able to do that from a fantasy standpoint. We are going to talk about the Buccaneers run game coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But with the playoffs being over, we get fewer games and the sports just aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Right now, the Dodgers are the favorites to win the World Series at plus 310. while the Tampa Bay Rays are having a rough year and are sitting at plus 31,000. If you would rather get in on some NFL odds early on, the Chiefs and 49ers are tied atop the Super Bowl odds at plus 600, while the Buccaneers are sitting at plus 6,500 and are plus 310 behind the Atlanta Falcons to win the NFC South. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen or view every day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm trying to help you win your fantasy leagues right here today, talking about the Buccaneers and their fantasy values, because let's be honest, it's not just Buccaneers fans. It's fans of every team across the nation that overvalue their own players because they love the players on the team that they root for each and every week of the NFL season. So I'm here to try to kind of put all of that in perspective for everyone and tell you where these guys line up. So let's talk about the run game with Rachaad White and Bucky Irving. Rachaad White was running back 7 last year, thanks in large part to his increased use in the passing game throughout the season. He was targeted on almost 13% of Baker Mayfield's passes last year, which is a solid number considering you have Mike Evans and Chris Godwin there. And while they added Jaylen McMillan and Sterling Shepard, I don't think that Rachaad White's target share drops too much. The issue with Rachaad is the touchdowns. Only 6 rushing touchdowns last season, so you're putting a lot of emphasis on his rushing and receiving opportunities and his yardage. In the games where he did score rushing touchdowns, he finished as the running back 9, the running back 1, the running back 14, the running back 10, and the running back 9 on those weeks. So always, at the very least, he's a high-end RB2. Over the course of the season, he finished outside the top 20 just 4 times. If anything, even without being, a touchdown machine, Rachaad was incredibly consistent. You knew he was a plug-and-play top 20 running back just about every week, and that's going to continue into this season. Rachaad is currently being drafted on average at the top of the 4th round, which is an incredible spot for value. A lot of you listening are going to be in leagues where other Bucs fans or with other Bucs fans. So he's probably going to go earlier, maybe the mid to early 3rd round. But these are the guys on average being drafted around him. Isaiah Pacheco, Joe Mixon, Jalen Waddle, DJ Moore, Malik Neighbors, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, and Trey McBride. I would take Rachaad over almost all of those players. Now, full disclosure, I'm a late quarterback drafter, so I'm taking him before Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes, but I'm also taking him over Trey McBride, DJ Moore, and Joe Mixon. Then, depending on the roster construction, up to that point, I might take him over Waddle, although I do love Jalen Waddle this season. But if it's the late 3rd, early 4th, and I have 2 stud receivers, I'm taking Rachaad White. Pacheco, I think, might overall have a better season given the offense that he's in, but he lacks the consistency that Rachaad White has. I'm looking for that level of safety and reliability, so I'm probably going to lean Rachaad White even over Isaiah Pacheco. Pacheco played in 14 games last year, and he had a top 20 finish in just 8 of them. As for Bucky Irving, we aren't really sure what he's going to be or how he's going to be used at this stage. So he's nothing more than a late pick in your drafts. Probably in the last round if you feel that you can stash him on your bench. But I think he'll largely go undrafted except in those really deep leagues or those leagues that are constructed of primarily Buccaneers fans. You can take the flyer on him if you want, but my guess would be you're using up a roster spot that could be better spent on a player with a more clear role in his offense. And that's probably going to be one of the first players that you cut in order to pick someone up. Bucky is a back of the roster kind of player to start this season until we really see how Liam Cohen wants to utilize him. If you're going in those late rounds, it's a high upside pick and you're looking for those sleepers and those, potential explosive players. I'm just not sure that in his rookie year, Bucky Irving is going to have that level of impact on your fantasy roster. Rather, it's going to be a larger impact on the Bucs offense as a whole. In terms of the NFC South, Rachaad is the number 2 running back in the division for fantasy. Bijan Robinson is the clear number 1 running back out of the South for fantasy purposes and maybe overall, depending on how the Falcons look this season. But he's going to get a lot more opportunity than he did last year under this new coaching regime. Bijan is basically going in the first round of your draft. He's probably going to be the second, maybe the third running back off the board. So if you look to snag Rachaad in the late third, early fourth, you are going to be very, very happy with the production and the consistency that you're getting at the running back spot. Then third, I have Alvin Kamara. He's still a viable option given his usage in the passing game. He could rack up easy points in a full or half point PPR. There was a game last year, he had 13 receptions for only 30 yards, but that was still, a 9.5 point output in just the receiving game for not a lot of in-game production, but a lot of fantasy production. And then one last thing, don't be scared to take Jonathan Brooks, the running back from Carolina. Once he returns from injury, he is going to be the Panthers offense. If you have an IR spot on your roster, draft him around the 10th round where he's going. He's going late 9th into the mid 10th, and then stash him on your IR and pick up a player off the waiver wire. He could end up being a championship winning fantasy player for your team, given when he's going to join your fantasy roster and then the utilization that he is going to have with those fresh legs in the Dave Canales offense. That's a guy that you want on your team. Real quick, let's talk about tight ends. The only one in the NFC South that I would draft is Kyle Pitts. That said, his average draft position is in the 6th round, and that's still way too high for my liking. He has burned all of us every year of his NFL career in terms of value for your fantasy roster compared to where you drafted him. So you're drafting him based on the hope that the offensive coordinator is competent enough to use him and his immense talent. Other than that, Cade Otton is not going to provide you anything of value outside of picking him up for a week when your regular tight end is on a bye. Since tight end is a position where you only need one, Otton likely will not make it onto any rosters outside of a streaming option. He had one finish last year in the top 12. And that was against Houston when he finished as the number 3 tight end on the week with 20 points. Other than that, he had 2 finishes at the tight end 13. So just outside being one of the top starters in fantasy for that week. And then he had finishes at 33, 35, 81, 51, and 44. That is not going to change much this season. He's going to be a short yardage target, an occasional red zone target. He's going to help the Bucs move the chains. He's going to help them on scoring drives, but he's not going to do jack squat for you for your fantasy roster. So we all love Cade Otton. You all know this is a pro Cade Otton podcast, but do not draft him in fantasy. He is not going to do anything for you, and it could potentially cost you pivotal matchups and cost you a spot in the playoffs. Talking wide receivers and the one you need to take to win your league. That is next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. So many of us put all of our focus and our energy and our time into making sure that we're there to provide for other people and always put ourselves on the back burner, and that can lead to problems building up from being left back there too long. That's why it's so important to treat your mental health with the same care and attention that you give to everyone else in your life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and designed to fit around your busy schedule so that you don't have to leave yourself on the back burner anymore. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Wrapping things up here on a Wednesday edition of the Locked On Bucs podcast, and it is wide receiver time. And some of you may not like what I have to say. Let's start with Mike Evans, last year's wide receiver 5 after a 1,200-yard, 13-touchdown performance. And I'm just saying, I don't think this happens again. He's going to get his 1,000, and he's probably going to get you 7 to 9 touchdown receptions. But that's why I'm telling you now that you probably shouldn't draft him. Let's say, for argument's sake, he finishes with the same number of receptions as last year. That was 79. He gets you 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. That's a great season, right? We're talking about Mike Evans on this show week in and week out. He did it again. He tied Jerry Rice's record. He was a red zone threat. He was getting in the end zone. But he would have finished as the wide receiver 15 last season, right in between Brandon Ayuk and Michael Pittman, all from dropping 150 yards and 5 touchdowns off of his totals. This year, he's being taken at the top of the third on that second to third round wheel as the wide receiver 10. There's a decent chance that he doesn't hit that mark, and you're going to wind up disappointed. If you draft him as the 10th wide receiver off your board and he finishes as the wide receiver 15, you're going from a wide receiver 1 to a wide receiver 2, and you're going to be disappointed. Again, what could be a great season for regular football might let you down in fantasy after what he did last year. Now, again, you're going to have some consistency with Mike Evans. Over the course, over the course of the last 10 years, Mike Evans is the number 1 most consistent wide receiver year by year. You know, at the end of the day, you're going to get a ton of targets, a lot of receptions, 1,000 yards. Week to week last year, he finished outside the top 26 times, never more than 2 weeks in a row. Unfortunately, in the week where most leagues play their championships, he finished as the wide receiver 37. That's not even a wide receiver 3. He was a borderline flex play at best, and that might have hurt you pretty bad in the money game, the trophy game, the bragging rights game, however your league is structured. You were incredibly disappointed in a guy who had been so reliable all year, having that level of finish when it mattered the most. Evans is a guy that I would love to have on my roster this season, but I can't bring myself to spend the draft capital for where he is going. Now, I can get a much better value later and probably have one of the top producing players, one of the biggest draft values, and a potentially championship winning player in Chris Godwin. A lot of people are basically out on Chris Godwin. He finished as the wide receiver 31 last year and is being taken at the back of the 8th round this year. His fantasy season last year was bad. 3 straight weeks outside the top 40 to open up the season. And then from week 6 through 14, he had 1 week where he was a top 15 wide receiver, and he had 8 weeks outside the top 25, including 6 straight weeks where his highest finish was 37. He hit that number 3 times over that span. Then it was up and down to finish the year: wide receiver 6, wide receiver 32, wide receiver 15, wide receiver 35. He finished with 1,000 yards on 83 receptions, and that was great, but he only scored 2 touchdowns. I am all in on drafting Chris Godwin this year because the value is insane in the late 8th and early 9th round. We know that Cohen wants to put him back at the slot and use him the way that Cooper Kupp was utilized in LA while Cohen was there. We also know that he's finally all the way back from injury, and we can throw in that it's a contract year and he's going to look to have a massive breakout year. Godwin is already a PPR monster, and I think we're looking at least 90 receptions this season. What will make or break it is the touchdown numbers. Godwin could easily be the value that Evans was last year. If you remember going back, Evans was a 5th or a 6th round pick last year and finished as a top 5 wide receiver. Godwin is currently going around the same spot as Jordan Addison, Ladd McConkey, Xavier Worthy, Rome Odunze, Zamir White, Jake Ferguson, and David Njoku. Godwin's upside is insane compared to these players being taken around him. Over the last 10 years, I mentioned that Mike Evans was the number 1 most consistent wide receiver over the last decade. Godwin has been the 16th most consistent fantasy wide receiver out there. I find it more likely that he returns to his wide receiver 2, which would be a wide receiver ranked between 13 and 24, than staying at a low-end wide receiver 23 like he was last year. And again, it's all about the value. You get into those middle rounds, you're trying to find that sleeper, that guy that's going to explode and really give you a massive return on draft investment. As for Jaylen McMillan, you all know that I'm really, really high on him this season, but I am treating him the exact same way that I'm treating Bucky Irving. If you have a deep league or a huge bench, take him at the end of your draft and stash him. Otherwise, you're going to want to try to snag him on the waiver wire before that huge blow-up game that he has. So it's a little bit risky, but if you need to drop a player or your IR spot is being filled with a guy like Jonathan Brooks and you have a borderline flex player go down to injury, you need to fill that roster spot, that's when you pick up Jaylen McMillan. And again, hopefully it's before the huge breakout game so that you're not subject to your order in the waiver wire or having to burn a ton of fab in order to ensure that you get him. As for the NFC South as a whole, I'm probably going to list Drake London as the fantasy wide receiver 1 in the division. His opportunities this year are going to go through the roof, and historically, whoever Kirk Cousins' top target is ends up as a huge fantasy producer. London is going to have a big year, and again, he's being drafted about a full round before Mike Evans. I'm not in on Drake London at that price, but he is probably going to be the top producing wide receiver in the division. Then number 2, I'm going Mike Evans, then Chris Olave, because he is going to be the entire passing offense for New Orleans. Then I have Chris Godwin, Deontay Johnson in Carolina, I think becomes Bryce Young's favorite target. From there, it's a toss-up between Darnell Mooney and Rashid Shaheed. I would not recommend drafting either of those guys. But again, if you're in a 12-man, really deep league, maybe you're in a 3 flex or a 3 wide receiver, you're looking at Darnell Mooney and Rashid Shaheed in those double-digit rounds. But I am for sure making one of my top targets in the draft, Chris Godwin. He has the highest upside at the best draft cost. I'm not sure that I want to pull the trigger on London or Mike Evans, as I mentioned. If you're at the top of the 3rd, depending on how the draft board looks, that's when I might pull the trigger on either one of those guys. But both of their draft prices are personally just too steep for me. So I want Godwin in that 8th round where he is currently going. If you're in a league with a lot of Bucs fans, they are going to target Godwin a little bit earlier. I still believe if you're getting him at the top of the 7th, his return on that value is going to be immense. That is going to do it for this episode of Locked On Bucs. Coming up tomorrow, I will be talking about those joint practices with the Bucs and the Jags, how day 1 went. And then Friday, I'll be joined by Evan Klosky for a WTSP Friday episode. Had to shuffle some things. Evan has been traveling, so he will be on the Friday episode. In the meantime, though, please check out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. Make sure that you are following on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at JYarcho_Bucs. Subscribe on YouTube with those notifications turned on, or on your favorite podcast platform of choice. And of course, become a Locked On Bucs insider. Help support the show, and you're going to get one-on-one text conversations with me, as well as updates, rumors, thoughts, all those types of things. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.